Alright, call this house to order. Firstly, congratulations to all the teams who made it this far. Big round of applause. In opening government, we have Awas Matan Panjang. Delphinium. Closing government, we have INUC. And in closing opposition, we have the very new, very young CFSC. My name is Arina. I'll be chairing this debate. Kindly with me are media from your EM. And Benny, our guest judge from Hawaii. Alright, so the motion about free trade agreements in Malaysia should not be into that stuff. Call this house to order. I'd like to call for the Prime Minister to take us speech.
Madam Chair, we think there's a problem right now when there exists free trade agreement, especially with developing countries, because we think developing countries essentially need to essentially have this form of protectionism with them, because we think developing countries at the end of the day need to start off these industries and gain this revenue on their own, right, and essentially start off before being completely taken over by foreign direct investments. We think at the end of the day, developing countries need to have this form of government intervention, government protection towards themselves, and we're going to prove to you, the burden of proof coming from opening up is to prove to you that this makes developing countries even worse off, and we think that foreign direct investments is not always good, and especially when there's no form of protectionism and there exists a free trade agreement. The context is basically coming from outside of that we're going to set this basically in any developing countries. I mean, it's not exactly just limited to Malaysia, but any country we exist with a big brother, small brother form of context, right? That means there exists one big brother, which is a country which is already like good at whatever industries. Those local industries there are highly competitive, country which is essentially not as competitive, slowly starting to develop, and is slowly starting to get and start to use all these resources. Now, onto the idea of protectionism, right? We're going to characterize to you why governments essentially do this on the status quo, why is it important, and then we're going to show to you the harms of this at the end of the day later. Now, what is the idea of protectionism? Why do governments essentially do this? Basically, at the end of the day, right, when there exist small countries at the end of the day, governments essentially want to protect the small industries, right? The reason why we essentially do this is because we know for a fact that if we do not have this form of protectionism, the small industries will just die out, right? That the competition coming from big monopolies and big other, other companies will be too great that you essentially kick them out of the to begin with. We think that's essentially very problematic, right? We think that government need to protect these individuals and to make sure that they just don't go bust. The problem right now is that when you now implement like a free trade agreement, governments can't even tax these individuals, and we think that's essentially problematic. We think right now that these individuals will be highly incentivized to come in, but governments cannot regulate and cannot essentially give the competitive advantage to local industries. Local industries require this form of competitive advantage because they're starting to grow, right? And we think that it's important that society also get brand loyalty and brand confidence to all these individuals, because without this form of loyalty and confidence between these individuals, we think the problem is these industries cannot grow to begin with. Closing.
So are you not going to consider free trade agreement at all? So is that going to be a point in time where you would want to consider?
We think that even if you consider free trade agreement, is that it's in the far future when these individuals can actually exist on their own. That means you have companies which actually stand on their own 2 feet, where there exists less chance of monopoly, where it prevents these companies from essentially these local companies from being complacent, and where it essentially creates a form of competition. So these foreign direct investments who come in cannot monopolize this market and to then extent improve these products and then create in the future. But that's far from now, and not to be essentially, most of these countries essentially won't have the problem. Now, I already taken one. Now, what's the problem when you essentially don't have free trade agreement? Because we think right now, where in these countries, you're starting to get this, starting to grow. You have a lot of booming industries starting to grow. And most of these countries who come into these countries essentially have too much competition in their country and therefore come into these countries, right? No. We think the problem with this is that it harms the local industry and creates a form of monopoly. What is the harm of monopoly, right? Where there exists a form of monopoly, we think that all these resources are going to be used up and all this money and resources is going to be given to these monopolies, right? Local industries, cannot stand on their own 2 feet. The problem with this, right, it doesn't allow these companies to develop. SMEs, right, which most of these companies essentially are, will go out of bust. And we think this is highly problematic. Where's the problem with this also is that governments can't get any form of revenue to begin with, because in status quo, even if you were to allow these industries to even exist in the first place, right, like we have Proton cars and we have Mercedes, where governments are allowed to tax these individuals highly, right, to disincentivize people to go to these industries and essentially give this competitive advantage to local industries. The problem with that, with free trade agreements, governments are not allowed to essentially tax these individuals, or even if they do, it's a problem with this, right? There's no form of government revenue to begin with, because you have to understand that although that FDIs essentially allow supply chains to exist, right? Like everybody who now needs to cater to this thing gets money, we think the circulation of money essentially goes overseas. That is why governments tax these individuals to begin with. Sit down. So this is where we prove to you FDIs is not always good. Why? Because when FDIs exist in these industries, right, foreign direct investments essentially get revenues and export it out of the country, right? All this currency at the end of the day goes out of countries. So for example, Malaysia and McDonald's, right, all the money which we essentially get from McDonald's don't go back into Malaysia. Majority of it goes back to US and wherever McDonald's want to send it. The problem with the problem with right now, the best way governments essentially get this money back is through taxation, which no longer exists under our side. We think that because, right, these companies will be very highly incentivized to come in. We think this is essentially problematic. Why? Because when money circulation happens outside, especially for developing countries, it makes it much harder because we're highly reliant on these individuals. That means if these individuals want to pack up and go, they can essentially do it, right? If they don't if they deplete all the resources. No, we think they don't have this intrinsic need to take care of these countries and to protect these individuals, right? And we think that's why governments essentially do it. This is why we think essentially free trade agreement, and we can do it in the future. Why? Because if we do not allow free trade agreement to exist, right, what we can essentially do is we can get these individuals, local SMEs, to be much more competitive. These individuals can create the internal circulation. Society will essentially society at the end of the day will be motivated to join, to be loyal to this form of products to begin with. These individuals will have the competitive advantage, and we think that then, if you want to bring in foreign investors in the future, then it's okay, simply because, right, there exists these individuals are able to stand on their own. They won't be just flushed out just like that, right? There exists a competition in this industry, and we think no. We think at the end of the day, this is good. We don't think right now in developing countries, essentially, this is good, right? We think this is highly problematic, and we think this is an issue, right? We think this is why we shouldn't allow free trade agreement, especially for even countries like Malaysia, because at the end of the day, there exists a huge interest for other individuals to come in and monopolize our markets. So at the end of the day, when you have this huge reliance on these individuals, right, You cannot develop these industries. You cannot have this form of self-sustenance and self-reliance. We think it's highly problematic. So what have we essentially proven to you in this debate? We showed to you that basically in developing countries, right, it has a need for governments to exist a form of protectionism. Governments usually gain revenue from taxation. Governments usually gain their form of competitive advantage, which you give to the smaller countries through taxation, which no longer exists when you now have free trade agreement. Or even if you're going to have taxation, it'll be much lower and much more harder for these companies to exist. We showed to you right now that monopoly is essentially very problematic. How foreign direct investments is never good because they export money usually out of the country and rarely have circulation inside the country. We've proven to you all those reasons, and for that, we're back to oppose.
Thank you very much. Now to start with the case of the opposition bench, I'd like to invite leader of opposition.
Finally, a chance to speak, because the question that I wanted to ask the government bench is, a lot of their arguments and harms towards the free trade agreement seems to heavily assume that there will be no exports of goods from developing countries to developed countries. So is the government bench also against free trade agreement with developing countries as a union? For example, the dozens of FTAs that have come out of ASEAN. But moreover, we'll talk about why it's harmful for why it's better for developing countries to accept free trade agreements across the board. My three arguments will firstly be, why is it in the best interest of developing nations to accept? Secondly, why are developing countries better protect free trade agreements? Thirdly, why does rejecting free trade agreements disproportionately harm developing countries? 3 points of rebuttals that's outstanding. Everything else will be self-resolving. Firstly, free trade agreements harms only countries that are harms only. For example, like a lot of these harms that came out from Kanda was talking about, what if there's too much products that come in and we heavily tax their products and we don't support local goods. But that none of those things apply to the dozens of FTAs that currently exist within ASEAN. Like, what are your foreign direct investments that are so competitive coming from, say, Thailand to like Malaysia? What are the taxation that you will place? It's so threatening to the local economy. We don't see any logical analysis coming from the opening government. But secondly, he assumes also there is no outgoing or exportation in terms of trade from developing countries. We say it will still exist. In fact, we better facilitate, because now we can compete against, we don't have to pay the extra tariffs, we don't have to pay heavy duties when it comes to the free movement of goods, labor, travel, all that. So we think it's better for free trade agreement. He only wanted to talk about it on one side. But lastly is this problem about Proton. We think if Proton cannot compete, we think we shouldn't live with, we think people should abolish set to compete with any other markets. If they're not better than Honda, then they should wake up and realize that. First argument, why is it in the best interest of developing countries to accept? There are 4 freedoms that are always guaranteed: movement, goods, labor, tariffs. And why is this important? Because these must be contrasted against pre-existing agreements of unions. For example, the reason why we have the European Economic Zone that was built to compete with the United States of America after World War II is because we didn't want a monopoly of steel and economy by the United States. That's why the European countries got together to compete with the United States. Because there's a realization that there is a limitation to the amount of things that you can do with a local industry solitarily. That's why you need a union of underdeveloped countries to compete against a monopoly that was the United States. Malaysia, with its current negotiations with the European Union, should facilitate the free trade agreement, because that is the only way it can compete against pre-existing unions, because all they want to argue against is developing countries should not enter into free trade agreements. But that doesn't resolve all the other free trade agreements against already developed countries under the status quo. You have loads of benefits with trading with pre-existing unions. For example, the exchange of minerals that you don't see in like regional blocks like ASEAN. What is the great innovation that you're going to get? How different is rice and grain in Malaysia in comparison to, say, Thailand, right? So obviously there's already a dire necessity. It's in the best interest, because we need to compete against pre-existing unions. Secondly, countries better protected under the free trade agreement. Under the status quo, there is already a network of countries that deal with each other. So like your facade of self-sufficiency with protectionism will be likely to fail. But like every other instance, we need supranational support. It is insufficient for Malaysia to continue with the way it is. But this extends beyond just economy. Like look at protection. The reason why we don't want other countries to develop, like the reason why we don't want other countries to develop nuclear weapons, that's why we extend the nuclear umbrella to countries like Korea to protect them, right? The same way we need to extend free trade agreements from current agreements. We included clauses like the peace clause, especially when it comes to agriculture. What is the peace clause? The peace clause grants special protection to developing countries and the free trade agreement countries, i.e. due to self-interested reasons, other nations within the free trade agreement can sanction that breach of agreement. So there is better protection for developing countries under this agreement. For example, we had Canada like breaching the agreement in regards to fisheries against Japan. That's why many countries like sanctioned Canada on this particular matter. There was better protection for developing countries like Japan. After this point, let's then look at the current economic progression and why it's insufficient. You're only confining yourself to a domestic market. For example, revisiting my example of Thailand and Malaysia in regards to grain. But the harms to that is you have less exchange in technology, less exchange in skill sets, you have less innovation of goods. But this isn't just the clincher. The clincher is that you only stop developing countries because it outweighs the cost. But other developed countries that have a crazy amount of capital will still be able to pay all your taxes and disregard the free trade agreement. The only people that can't are developing countries, and that leads me to my third substantive. But I'll take a point of information.
All right, with some analysis of the bigger industries of the world, such as General Motors as well as Volkswagen, both of them started from an initially rooted into the particular country with no free trade. This is how they grew. How do you defend against?
Yeah, but they didn't need to compete against pre-existing General Motors at the time. But we already have those things now. That's why you can't protect them against an inevitable truth of the world. Why does rejecting free trade agreements disproportionately harm developing countries? These guys still have trade, but the question is, because the government isn't banning trade, right? They don't want a completely absolute domestic circulation of the market. That means that who will have the monopoly? Developed countries that are able to pay off the tariffs, pay off the taxes. People that can cushion the blow of the tariffs and all the taxes that you will place. People like countries and markets like Malaysia that cannot compete against say McDonald's or Nestle. These are the people that will never be able to push out or go into other markets. So like if you are really want to protect Proton, they will be in a worse off position because they cannot cushion the blow against General Motors. Why don't developing countries form individual bilateral agreements then? Why is free trade agreements so essential? Because there is a high regulation in regards to quality, labeling, quantity, cost-effective measures. Like there's a QC to this. If you disregard or you don't accept free trade agreement, it's more likely that they'll go to like fringe nations like China. That's why China has up the whole African countries when it comes to certain industries like transportation. That's why it's a dilapidated industry because they never wanted to conform to the regulations of an FTA and went to like fringe nations. We are very happy to say that we should accept FTAs.
Very much. I'd like to invite you.
Yeah.
I had two objectives coming into this debate. Number one was to debate in this room behind this podium in pre-quarters. That has been achieved. My second objective will deal with the nature of economy and in developing countries and how the free trade agreement directly clashes with their ability to grow and become developed countries eventually, right? And we're going to analyze the societal aspects of this, especially when people become overly dependent on foreign goods within their countries because their domestic goods are unable to grow due to this excessive competition that we create with free trade agreements, right? But first, let's look at some rebuttals coming from Siron's outstanding speech, okay? He talked about how in these circumstances, countries need to join in together and form a union to allow free trade agreements to exist. This is the very problem here, right? Because they are inefficient and unable to stand on themselves, they have to join in order to allow free trade agreements to exist. This policy, this motion directly deals with countries standing on their own. And when these countries stand on their own, they are unable to compete, which is why they have to form unions. We say this is essentially bad because now it clearly, now we see that in order for weak countries to exist, they have to join in together. And this problem of joining in together is that the revenue or the economy generated is something as of a whole, and it doesn't directly benefit each country on its own because everything is shared and everything is interconnected, right? Next thing, they talk about how sanctions can happen and free trade agreements are highly regulated. We say that this context applies to very developed countries and countries that can match each other's standards, right? Even if regulation were to happen heavily, right, we tell you this is very problematic because now countries, especially developing countries, have this urgency to continuously export their things in order to gain immediate revenue. We see that even with regulation existing, this can be problematic because those countries are unable to match up with the standards and regulations eventually become ineffective, right? Under our paradigm, when we continue to have free trade agreements, government intervention exists on a greater level because active policy measures are taken to ensure that the economy can operate on a daily basis, right? Please say I'm not done with your rebuttals. Third thing, right? They say that it's very harmful because now the domestic economy is very absolute and things will only circulate within the country, right? We said that this will greatly exist when you remove free trade agreements, right? Because now governments will be forced to try and maintain the economy within their countries, especially when their resources are being pushed out, right? That's when it becomes harder to have internal circulation of the economy within the country, right? So we say this becomes worse off with free trade agreements, right? So that is why we need to reject it. But before I go, try me.
So yeah, under your regulation, how much power does the Malaysian government have against, say, India or like Canada if they happen to breach any bilateral agreement that you have with them outside of the FTA?
Simple. We have import tariffs and export subsidies, right? We say that countries naturally abide to these principles, and with that, they are able to respect these bilateral trade agreements, right? But when you have free trade agreements existing in developing countries, all these pre-existing regulations now fall. Now it's easier for countries like India to try and monopolize the Malaysian economy because they don't have anything that will prevent them from effectively putting their force over Malaysia, right? Now, what has Kanda talked to you about today? He talked about protectionism and why big brother and small brother governments exist naturally, right? We tell you in smaller countries, in developing countries, what they naturally are is that now they're trying to build this foundation to create a very industrious economy, right? They're still walking up this ladder. And that is why their foundation, their basis is very important to be set firmly. If we allow foreign direct countries to come in and affect us, we say that this could be a big problem, right? Even if a trade balance is going to exist, we tell you that these developing countries have a sense of urgency to try and make the greatest revenue within the shortest period of time. And we say once they do that, resources start to become depleted, right? And we say that two harms can exist when you allow free trade agreements to exist. Number one, if, let's say, developing countries like their economies were to crash, because they have been exporting their resources on a very big supply, other countries depending on Thailand for rice, for instance, will now face the after effects because Thailand's economy has crashed, right? And this is because of dumping. This is because of dumping issues where we want to dump our resources immediately, right? Second harm that can exist, right? What if these sources run out? What if eventually all of Malaysia's rubber abilities run out, right? What's going to happen then? All these countries will now leave Malaysia and move on to other sources, to other countries to gain their revenue. In this instance now, this whole free trade agreement, this whole ability of wanting to develop Malaysia's economy now loses out because we are leaving you once you're out of what we want from you, right? Let's move on to my argumentation, right? The nature of developing countries and societal effects, right? I've already shown to you how in developing countries, there is a need for great protectionism to exist. That's why countries like the United States, they take active measures to protect their steel industry because it's something of a source that is limited for them, right? If they were to continuously export that, their ability to make secondary products from these sources now becomes greatly harmed. That is why Malaysia only exports 10% of its rubber and uses the balance of it to make other products, which is why we as a country can now export the most amount of medical gloves to other countries, right? And that creates a greater amount of revenue coming from outside, right? Secondly, please sit. We talk about how loyalty, brand loyalties and brand confidence will greatly be harmed under our platform, right? We say now countries with foreign companies in Malaysia, our domestic products will be greatly harmed, right? Because now people would generally want to buy these things coming from foreign companies, which de-incentivizes them. And now it puts the government in a more harder position because they need to deal with this glorified perception coming from society towards them, right? So governments now have to try and actively incentivize their domestic SMEs to still be able to compete with these products, especially when they are still coming out. And secondly, governments will lose out because they're unable to collect tax revenues because free trade agreement generally removes that from foreign direct investment coming into us, right? We tell you that this sense of urgency is going to push developing countries to the max. And once they reach their max limit, other countries who are supposed to be supporting them will leave us. That's when our economies as developing countries will be greatly affected. So what happens when we reject these free trade agreements? We allow SMEs and we allow our domestic industries to boom up to a greater level so that when they form agreements with other countries, they are able to compete. That's when brand loyalty and brand confidence within the people to our domestic products is greatly achieved. That's when we're able to achieve a developing economy because our sources are still sustainable and our industries are able to compete with that. Let's reject free trade agreements. Thank you.
Alright, thank you very much. Now let me invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to give his speech.
You see, the problem with protectionism is that it is ineffective because Proton has overly depended on the Malaysian government for protectionist policies, right? And what happened to Proton? They've remained in the infant industries and they have not developed much over the course of 20 years in which the Malaysian government has helped Proton, has provided a protectionist help to Proton, right? So this is particularly problematic coming from side government. I have two things to talk about in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the spillover effects of a free trade agreement on the local industries. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the role of Malaysia in a free trade area, for example, ASEAN as a big brother in ASEAN, right? But before that, I have 4 points of rebuttals. Firstly, why foreign direct investment doesn't affect it that much. I have two things to talk about because he spoke of how FDIs under our paradigm would harm the local industries. Well, firstly, FDIs under our paradigm, especially the effect of FDIs in free trade areas is from countries like Thailand and Indonesia. So if all your benefits that are accrued from the lack of foreign direct investment from Thailand and Indonesia is not harmful because we can still compete. Like the local industries can compete with foreign direct investments from countries like Myanmar, from countries like Indonesia, from countries like Thailand, right? Because foreign free trade agreements with other developing nations, for For example, Myanmar corporations will not bring much damage to local industries. But secondly, even with aggressive FDIs from other countries, right, it is largely beneficial. Because Siran talked to you about how it benefits the economy, because there will be an exchange of technology, because there will be an exchange of skilled labor, because there will be an exchange of innovation. No, thank you. So it's not that harmful on a balance of harms, right? But secondly, he spoke of how there will be a lack of internal circulation, because it will be harder for other more developed economies to affect our local industries. Two responses to this. Firstly, this is not true, because countries like Canada and India, even with tariffs, can still pay off those tariffs and penetrate our local industries anyway. But secondly, there will be a lack of economic benefits on our side, because countries like Malaysia, no thank you, developing nations or economies like Malaysia cannot pay tariffs, cannot export and breach the markets of other developed economies, right? So it disproportionately harms the developing nations if you don't have free trade agreements. No, thank you. But thirdly, Dave spoke of how resources would run out, right? But this is a value neutral argument, because people in the local industries, when they buy more things from the local industries, they'll consume like local rice, for instance, and the resource would still run out anyways, right? But fourthly, he spoke of how it would help SMEs, it would bring them up, and it would help like infant industries, right? So what you're doing to help these SMEs is marginal, because these SMEs with protectionist policies would stay infant, would overly depend on protectionist policies, and there would be no your consequence of self-sustenance and self-reliance is one that is unrealistic. But before I move on to my substantive, sure.
Even without free trade agreements, governments in Malaysia have to promote like a campaign to buy Malaysian products, because we don't have internal circulation. With free trade, then these products become cheaper. Don't you think governments essentially have to spend more money now to incentivize local markets to exist in the first place?
It is not the burden of the government to increase the quality of goods. To increase the quality of the goods in the local industries. We think for self-reliance and self-sustenance to happen, for competition to increase, the local industries have to wake up and do something about it. We are against protectionist policies, right? So, substantive, spillover effects on local industries. Like, this argument is nuanced to a developing nation like Malaysia. Therefore, it has to correspond to economic policies and certain socio-economic truths, right? And what are those socio-economic truths? I have five socio-economic truths about Malaysia. Firstly, GST. That tackles with your problem on tax revenue. Tax revenue is compensated with GST, so your harms on the lack of government revenue is minimized. But secondly, Malaysia is an aging population, right? But thirdly, Malaysia has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world. Four, Malaysia has a relatively high labor force within free trade areas like ASEAN, for instance. But five, and most importantly, the most tangible FTA point is that the most tangible free trade area within this debate is ASEAN. So the crux of this argumentation, we premised on this, right? So moving on to my point on increased competition. All protectionist measures meant to safeguard and boost the local industry has failed under their paradigm because of three reasons. Firstly, infant corporations that receive protectionist help in the form of tariffs have not improved much. Look at Proton, for instance, right? This is because they overly depend on the increased price of imports. So there's less incentive. So there's less incentive for them to improve their quality of their goods, right? To improve the quality of their cars and their technology. But second reason why protectionism has failed is because of consumer confidence in local goods. People no thank you. Due to the relatively low prices, right? People will perceive of people would perceive of these local goods that receive protectionist help as like naturally of lower quality, right? But thirdly, there'll be no thank you. The third reason is because of the lack of cheap imports reduces the competition, and it's particularly harmful for the local industry. So therefore, there will not be an increase in quality, and there will be an increase in quality with free trade areas, and this is a long-term benefit that we will accrue. On the flip side, with the abolition of tariff rates and the forming of the free trade area within this region, what will happen is two things. Firstly, there'll be a flood of cheap imports, and this is extremely beneficial to the consumers and the local industry. Secondly, there'll be an increase in competition. What happens is that the local industries would strive to compete with other foreign companies, right? And this would improve because of the change of and the local companies would improve because of the exchange of skill sets, labor, and innovation. If at all these local industries, local corporations, and infant companies die out, we think it's okay. Why is this? Because it is a reality of the market economy, and self-sustenance is best achieved without protectionism. Next point, on very briefly on Malaysia as a big brother in ASEAN. Malaysia has relatively high labor welfare versus countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and Myanmar, in which low wages, bad conditions, and low labor rights. Right? When tariffs increase, you increase the production cost, and it will further incentivize employers in like Indonesia to lower wages to maximize profit. When you abolish taxes and tariffs, you increase welfare of laborers in those countries. And Malaysia has a duty because it is on a higher pedestal in like the ASEAN region. And for all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. To continue the debate, the closing comments by a member of the
First, a few rebuttals to the side opposition. They're saying that actually by having the free trade, it will promote the competition. So we think it's not like that, because actually by not having the free trade, we actually can also improve the competition between our local products, because nowadays we cannot rely, people may not afford to buy the product from the outside. So now they have incentive, the people in our country have the incentive to improve their product, because our product also have the potential to grow. They're already there, but we need to like giving some motivation for them. So we think that by not having the free trade, we actually can like manipulate this aspect, and also at the end of the day, we can promote and encourage people in our country to be more competitive in their aspect and their product, and to produce product that are as well as good and high quality as being produced by the outside countries. So their arguments have fallen down. And the second rebuttal is about they're saying that consumer like nowadays having confidence to the local goods because they are cheap. No, we don't think like that, because they are also the local products that are very expensive, and also they are also outside products from the foreign countries that are very cheap. So we think that their argument is not really strong enough, because actually they are cheap and expensive product, and it's not just because people they are cheap product, they want people to not to have, they would like people to have the free trade. We don't think like that, because we actually, in the end of the day, we still need to support our local economy. We need to prioritize our local economy first, rather than to support the trade between the foreign countries, because we need to help our own price before we offer choice to the people, because actually our product have a variety of choice. So we think that we have the potential already, and at the end of the day, we just need to promote this. We think that arguments have fallen down. Also, no, thank you later. Okay. So the third one is they're talking about a lack of quality or whatsoever. So I think that I already like somehow thought about the quality, because we actually have the potential to grow, and I now will move on to my extensions. First of all, it's actually no, later I haven't finished. It can the self-sustaining economy. I will talk about the self-sustaining economy, because without free trade agreement, it actually can promote self-sustaining economy, because now citizens are forced to fill the product gap that was possibly needed through the free trade. Now people cannot depend on the outside products, so now people have to, this will give encouragement to the our product, to the outside product. So we think that our product also have the potential to expand, and also this can give them incentive and encouragement to go as high as being shown by the foreign companies. So we think that this actually can offer the benefits, because we cannot like just totally depend on the outside product, because we also have the incentive to promote our own products, and this is a very good way in our long run. Yeah.
You don't fill the product gap because they will still be there, because these developed countries will be able to shoulder the cost of the tariffs. But how do you improve export of your local goods, because it's too expensive for us without FTA?
No, we think that it's better for us if our own citizens fill the product gap, because it offers a lot of benefit rather than we just simply doing the free trade. No. So moving on to my second extension, is about the local economy, and also hamper and therefore damage the identity of the country. So with the free trade, like people will import products from other countries. So actually, like products from different countries can come into our country. So how about the identity of our own country, our own product? So it might cause the damage and bring more harm to the people, because our own identity can also at the end of the day being affected because of the products. No, thank you. Because of the products that are being brought by to our country. So we think that it's better for us to give more attention to our own products and to preserve our own identity, because every country have their own identity, and we don't want. It's better for people to have their own identity, because this make people recognize them, and this also a way for people to know each country because of the identity that they have in terms of their products and also in terms of their services and their goods. And now moving on to my next extension. No, thank you. In many occasions, the Malaysian products are below certain standard. This is my third extension. So talking about the Malaysian product, so this actually when we bring the products from other countries, and also this actually can hamper and give competition to our own local economies, because nowadays our own product is not really at really high standard. Now we bring countries, and this can actually give harm to our own economy, or for our own local aspect to grow and to further develop, because they have to compete with the standard from the outside countries. So we think it actually at the end of the final result can bring can kill off the local economies, and also we can expand our own economy. No, thank you. So in conclusion, we think that we need to preserve our own products, and just by having the free trade, actually we can just making that our product being killed off our local economies. So moving on to my next extensions, we think that the financial benefit by having the free trade actually do not really stack up due to inherent polarization of the market, because there are tendency of the cash to flow out. So we think that now with the free trade, the cash of money in our own country, in the developing country, will go to transfer to other countries rather than circulate in our own country. So we think that this really does not outweigh this will outweigh the benefits. So we think that it's not a good thing to consider at the first place, because it's better for us to make sure the circulation in our country is really strong and stable, rather than just having the tendency of the cash to flow out. So we think that our fourth extension is really need to be addressed. So what I have told to you so far. So our side opposition believe that actually we reject the free trade agreement among the developing countries as like Malaysia. So I would summarize the points that I have brought to you. First, it's actually creates a self-sustaining economy, because citizens are forced to fill the product gap that was possibly needed through the free trade. And secondly, also the free trade dilute the local economy and hamper and therefore damage the identity of the country. And thirdly, in many occasions, our Malaysian products are being, this can kill off our local economics. And also, lastly, the financial benefit do not really stack up due to inherent polarization of the market. However, let's say 20 years, actually if we do not have a free trade, and we can see that our own economy can still grow, and during that time we think that after a long day, the free trade is not needed, because we already achieved the quality and the achievement that are being needed just by not having the free trade agreement. With that, we'd like to propose. Thank you.
Yeah.
Forever young.
Maybe economics lah, maybe. Madam Chair, I think what this debate lacks is a characterization of developing nations, and whether or not developing nations like Malaysia is ready to accept the FTA. I think there's been very much generic argumentation coming from the side of the government why FTA is bad. I think that closing opposition will bring this contextual, will make it contextualized specifically to Malaysia and whether or not countries like Malaysia is ready, right? But before moving forward, I'll first like to just clear out what is the stance from closing opposition. Our stance in closing opposition is that we are okay with free trade agreement in principle, but we don't necessarily have to say that we're going to agree with opening up. It can slowly happen stages by stages, and it can and goods by goods. If you really analyze free trade agreement that exists in the real world, that there's no country in the world that's completely free. Like America still subsidizes their farmers, EU still have a common agricultural policy that's still heavily subsidizing their farmers. So we think that it can happen on a case-to-case basis. But the important thing here is that we need to start somewhere, and the debate has to start at that point in time, whether or not should we start now or should we not start it at all, right? Let's firstly analyze the three issues that I have in today's debate. Firstly, let's analyze where local business that dies out. Secondly, will Malaysia eventually get less profit and will consumer eventually be harmed, the extension coming from the side of closing government? Let's firstly analyze where local business dies out. What did they try to argue? They say that the local businesses can't compete with the foreign business. We think that this is a huge assumption. Yeah. Primarily because this argument on competition assumes that there's no alternatives if these local businesses were to die out. If you really analyze the way businesses work, like whenever that you stop opening up, whenever you stop, there's always a loophole for foreign companies to come in and build in those businesses. That you want to consider that these local businesses dies out, the employees of this business can still go to a foreign company, which means they're still well protected. But assuming that you want to really protect this local businesses, we think that it's going to be harmful because the kind of competition that exists within the protectionist realm is that it's very an average form of competition. You're not pushing these companies to compete with the companies that have a higher standard like foreign goods. So we think that in terms to competition will be much better in our side because these goods will be they will be able to improve. The other things that they say that the reason why we can't compete, that we can't regulate because we can't match up their standards. This is a huge assumption. Because if you analyze the nature of free trade agreement, there's always a negotiation. There can be a special clause for certain things. This is when we think if you have a problem with different standards, you can negotiate to meet it halfway, just like what US and India are doing with regards to the food security deal, because the reason why the deal prolonged so long was because there has to be a negotiation for them to meet halfway. So the conclusion to this, will local businesses die out? They won't, but even if they dies out, there are alternatives. Denied. Secondly, will Malaysia get less profit? They say that Malaysia is of tax. I think tax is a very generic thing. Maybe they were trying to imply tariffs because it's about import tax, right? So if you really are concerned about tariffs, I'll tell you this is my first extension. Why tariffs-based economy is bad? Because tariffs-based economy, because you really depend on exports for you to gain profit. What eventually going to lead to is that you're not developing your local businesses for you to compete with the foreign market. This is what happens in Philippines because they are so reliant on remittance economy, the money is pumping into the nation, but however the locals are not properly developed because there are no proper, the kind of training that's provided by government are probably just limited or probably not as good. So we think that tariff-based economy is bad. But even if you want to consider about tax, we think that we can still tax because you have corporate tax, and assuming that they said, oh, this foreign business is going to thrive within this nation, that we can tax them and we can get more profit, isn't it? So we think if tax is your concern, tax is still going to be there, and tariff-based economy is bad. And I'll analyze how this argumentation on capital outflow, like that assumes there's no alternative for this local business. I'll argue later on, well, there will be alternatives, not denied. Finally, will consumer be harmed? We think that consumer won't be harmed. In fact, in general cases, when you open up the market, consumer will get the benefit out of a free trade because that most likely this big MNCs coming from outside has reached an economy of scale, meaning they can already produce goods at a lower cost, meaning they can sell things much cheaper for people in that particular market. So we think at the end of it, the consumer will eventually going to benefit out of it because they are getting cheaper goods. Yes, NEPOI.
The problem is, right, we don't say free trade. We're not going to ban all free trade agreement. This only when this companies are ready, like Petronas, right? The reason why we essentially Petronas can compete right now is simply because we had free trade agreement last time, so they could grow, they could establish themselves, and now compete in the future.
The reason why Petronas can compete outside is not because we don't have no free trade agreement. It's because we have a lot of oil, and that's our competitive advantage. And I'll really analyze it later on in my argumentation. Let's firstly characterize developing nations. Like, what are developing nations? Normally, these developing nations aren't really like super poor and don't know what to do. Like normally they have a high skill labor, like Malaysia, we have like a lot of like professionals locally. Secondly, they have reasonable governance. They have their the governments can enforce a proper standard, and they have sufficient legal system to deal with abuse. But finally, I think what's more important with regard to developing nations, they are a growing economy. If you really want to analyze Malaysia, like our GDP from 2012 to 2014 has been steadily increased. We are at 2012, it's 287%, and at 2014, as of now, it's around 312%. In fact, our GDP per capita is increasing. In 2013, that the GDP per capita is 6,786. In 2004, as of now, it's 6,000. So what does this figure shows? This figure shows the developing economy like Malaysia are already showing trends of growth, and we think this is a trend that's worth considering. Not just that, because Malaysia has also concession in certain areas. That's why we think that moves nicely onto the extension that we're going to give, how specialization is going to be important. Because when you remove protectionist policies, naturally the government will focus on specialization. In fact, we've already identified certain areas in our NKEA, like palm oil and gas, like communication. We think it's worth for us to just focus on this area and develop. In fact, we have competitive advantage over other companies with regards to these areas. This is when we think that if your problem is exports, we can still export goods and survive, because we have an economy that we can still rely on when we stop to protect our local businesses. This is when we think the status quo, when you protect them, this won't happen, because government have to take care of every single one of them, and the kind of investment that the government have to give will have to be distributed across the board. Therefore, growth is going to be much harder. Assuming that we're able to reach high income nation, our side makes sure that we're able to achieve high income nation faster, because we focus on certain industries that we know we have a competitive advantage of. In conclusion, we think that we'll still survive, we'll still be okay. It's worth considering free trade agreement. Thank you.
So in the end of the day, what we're trying to pursue is, in fact, the long-term solution to the economy that is currently in our country. And through this, we actually have to actively develop our economy in the first place, rather than allowing foreign influences to come in and sort of lend a hand, rather than actually giving the right impetus that is absolutely necessary to kickstart this economy in the first place. Now, you see, all the a fundamental bunch of the arguments coming from side opposition is based on Proton. Why is it about Proton? Well, because most people know about Proton. Well, but you see, the thing is, when you take an argument such as this and you say that, you see, this kind of policy is in place, therefore local economies, when you get this sort of free trade protection for local economies, it doesn't work. Now, there are problems there, because it actually works. And in the end of the day, if you're actually analyzing foreign countries which have produced some of the biggest brands that we are aware of today, it is because of the kind of, it's the kind of localized market that was available at the time. And these countries were actually able to develop their market through, having a localized market. Did Volkswagen have to compete with General Motors? Yes, there is an oversight by Siron. They had to, but they did not. Because of that, Volkswagen was able to actually develop what is now a rather renowned brand, and possibly even bigger than General Motors in many regards. In the end of the day, this is where Aisha comes and tells you where there is a certain amount of identity that is rather important to a particular product that a country produces. Why do we say this? Because a certain identity in the end of the day confers a certain that actually allows this product to actually stand above. Because in the end of the day, hold on, perhaps later. In the end of the day, what happens is Germany has a certain expertise in producing a certain kind of product, but this would not possibly happen if this entire product was being diluted by various markets which they were forced to compete at the time because they were struggling. And at the end of the day, they could not develop what actually would have ended up being the competitive edge. In the end of the day, when you think of Italy, you think of Ferrari. Why is this case? If in the end of the, if we were to have say a free trade, so free trade to be happening, what will end up is there's a large level of dilution. In fact, you come up with generic products from all the other countries, and this takes away what is fundamentally a big advantage that could potentially be provided if we take away free trade agreements for the time being, not forever, and allow these local markets to actually foster and develop their own technology to a level that is comparable to elsewhere. Okay, go ahead.
If people always gravitate towards local identity, why is it in Malaysia people still buy foreign cars even if it's slightly more expensive than Proton?
All right. Well, you see, foreign cars tend to have a certain amount of quality that is at play. And this is precisely why people tend to prefer, outside cars. And not to mention, there is also some amount of stigma, as is demonstrated by your bench, for somehow hating Proton for producing substandard cars. So in the end of the day, what happens is, even though these products are slightly better, it is because we have never allowed them to facilitate some sort of real growth. Even when the Proton has now finally produced 150 horsepower cars, everybody says that Proton is garbage. Why? Don't you read the newspapers? Don't you understand statistics? This is the kind of development that we want. We cannot continuously tolerate foreign economies, perhaps later, coming in and destroying our market. So what is actually, so let us tackle some of the issues being brought out by that side. So first they admit that in fact free trades are supposed to produce about some sort of exchange in technology, especially when a country has higher exchange, higher technology being there in the first place. And then within that very same breath, Siron went on to say that, well, what is the real difference between rice in Thailand and Malaysia? Not to mention, he also actively encouraged local, like a sort of regional trading. So what happens is, in the end of the day, these benefits rather cancel out each other. So now let's look at this on both sides of the coin. If, let's say, we were to actually accept foreign markets to actually come in and sort of monopolize our market, this will then in fact destroy the market in the first place. And in the second case, where we actually allow local trades, there is no technology exchange to begin with, but rather it's a sort of an agreement for some sort of trade which will be menially profitable at best. Perhaps later. In the end of the day, what we want both sides of the houses to understand, that is in fact the kind of target that we are actually having is for in fact local economies to be able to have this competitive edge in the future. And among those contributing factors are in fact, for one, identities, as well as acknowledging that SMEs are a big part of the local economy that we have at the moment, and this is a 90%, roughly about 90% of our economy. So when Siron comes up and tells you that, if we think that if local economies can't compete, then it's fair for them to die out. Now you're talking about a 90% number. How much of the country are you willing to tolerate to die out before you actually understand that there's some need of protectionism to be put in place in order for us to achieve some sort of development? Okay, go ahead, Siron.
So on one hand, you tell us that a vast majority of people use Proton because the quality is great, but at the same time you argue that we will never be able to compete with like imported cars because the quality is as good. You can't have your cake and eat it as well.
No. Okay, yeah, I'll explain to you why. I'm not actually saying that Proton cars are not good. There's a variety of factors for why Proton cars may not outsell foreign cars. What I'm saying is that if we want Proton to eventually come to a point where it's objectively good, where you can say, I'd rather have that Proton over that Mercedes, we need to have this sort of thing put in place in order for that to happen. And we cannot take the short-term route and say that perhaps now this kind of situation is favorable. Perhaps now it's fine if foreign economies come in and produce cheaper goods than our SMEs can handle. It's fine that this is a short-term answer. In the end of the day, what we are trying to look for on-site long-term benefit. In the end of the day, what happens is when you actually have this sort of industries growing, we actually become, and when we actually do finally allow for free trade, we actually have a market that is already pretty much more susceptible to this kind of foreign products, because one, we're able to compete with them on equal grounds because now we have equalized the playing field, and not to mention that all these foreign products would also have to up their standards. And now in this new futuristic, in the future, in fact, now we can talk about technology exchange, because both industries are trying to beat each other in terms of actual technological development. So in the end of the day, when we talk about how higher quality goods can come in at a cheaper price, this is eventually detrimental, because in the end of the day, what we want to aim is to have local products that are equally as good, with not having to die out before they even was able to develop it to a proper level of acceptance to society. So let us let us reflect on what this debate should have been about from the start. So for one, in the end of the day, what we should actually aim for is a local economy that is actually beneficial and a long-term solution. Perhaps even in there are numerous setbacks that will be faced by accepting the model on their side, and in the long term also there are large benefits that have to be borne by us in the long run. So in the end of the day, our model best answers the question, that is, if we want an economy that is on par in the future, at least you'd have to side with side government. Thank you.
Alright, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the final speaker of the debate, opposition.
Three days ago, Bank Negara released a statement saying Malaysia's economy has grown up by 5.6% in the third quarter, followed by a 6.4% on the second quarter. Let me tell you a few things about these improvements. First of all, what are the major contributors towards this economic growth? Two things. One, the demand in private sectors, and second thing, the benefits we get from export of goods and services. Export and goods services, this is what I'm going to stress on you about because it directly relates towards free trade. Now, before I'm going to do a few things today. I'm going to rebut every single one of them on the ideas because it is very, very ridiculous. And second thing, I'm going to tell you when, how, and why free trade is needed in today's economic country, in today's country's economic. Now, the first thing, how the Prime Minister came up with how we will harm the country. Well, I say wrong. And second thing he came about here, he talked about, no, we don't want free trade because it's bad. And then he came out, and then a POI by Faiz, and then an answer of a POI by Faiz, he said, we want free trade, a little bit, not everything. And then the third thing he said, we want free trade, but in the future. And then he gives the argument of why in the future, because there are always new businesses that need protection program. Well, let me tell you one thing, Mr. Prime Minister, there is always a new businesses. If you're going to say that when you want to propagate the idea of a free trade, when new business, then your idea is basically infinity. That won't happen because new businesses are always developing every single day. That takes down your idea of how your assumption on those three things. And the second thing, you talk about how loss of government revenue. Let me tell you one thing. Taxes aren't the biggest government revenue. The biggest government revenue comes from other sections like, let's say, tourists, and mainly from exports. This is another thing that I also stress on, that by having a free trade, it will benefit them even much more. Now, the second thing he talked about was how FDI isn't always good. Okay, first of all, FDI comes and invests in local businesses. How is that bad? Please, POI and answer that. Second thing, he talked about how he clashes with the idea of it does not bringing benefits toward the small, medium, the SMEs. Because as I said before, FDI comes and invests in local businesses. How can you say that benefit doesn't come at all from foreign direct investment? And this also contradicts himself on the first idea, how small businesses will die out when foreign direct investment comes, because as I explained before, it is a ridiculous idea. Yes, but before that, stand for your partner.
The ability for new everyday companies to develop will diminish when you have ginormous pressures coming from big governments who will eventually stagnate our economy.
All right, then how about the small businesses that manage to survive those competition and come out to be a better quality businesses, which proves to be an identity of the country. Let's say, for example, how he gave example of the whip said how Ferrari was think of Italy. Let me tell you one thing. Ferrari wasn't always the international car, the national car for Italy. It was always some small car company we don't even know of. Exactly. When the car company dies out because of competition from other countries, other incentives are being brought forward. Let's say Ferrari, they develop in this competition area and hence become an idea of a national car of Italy. That brings down your idea of how it dies out small businesses. And now, the second member of government came up here and talked about how this foreign direct investment, let's say McDonald's, will monopoly the market and so on and so forth. Well, we tell you this isn't such a bad thing at all. Why? First thing, they provide jobs for people that the government have failed to provide for them. Shame blaming it on other countries, other businesses. And the second thing is that even if they come up here and monopoly a lot of things, we tell you that they build a lot of infrastructure and businesses that help in this country. Even if your argument says they will pack up and leave, well, go ahead, get out of here. We don't need you. We already have your infrastructure. We already have your people's workforce. We already have the development in this area towards other businesses. So I don't see how your problem is actually a problem. It actually benefits the country in the long run that they so want to propagate. But under our paradigm, it provides a longer benefit toward our country even more. Third thing, he talked about how circulation of money in the country is gone when these investors comes in. How? Investors gives money to people improve the quality of a product, and hence people buy more, and the cycle just stays there. So I don't get it. Now, third thing, how he talked about, as I said before, more foreign direct investment doesn't always be beneficial. No, foreign direct investment is always beneficial when it is used the right way. So it's not the problem of foreign direct investment. It's the problem of our own community using the money in the right way. Let's say Proton, if they were to get a higher foreign direct investment, they could develop a better car. For example, the new Proton Iris, where people are so crazy about toppling over Pro-Ams IV. Now, moving on, is and the deputy also came up here and talked about how this is the POI that he rejected. He said allow for the export of medical gloves and it will be exports and everything, and hence our finance will flourish. Okay, let me tell you one thing. When a free trade agreement is our main concern of countries' exports now is that we have to pay a high amount of tariffs by other countries. Let's say you made a free trade agreement between two countries. If they were to so import a bunch of medical gloves towards this country, wouldn't they benefit even more? Because now we have less expenditures we have to pay on tariffs alone. We have a lot of more revenues. Even we have a lot more money we can get from the revenues, even though the prices get slower. Why? Because we don't have to pay tariffs in that country on a certain specific items anymore. Third thing, how the member came up here and talked about our product isn't good enough in terms of quality. Let me ask you this question, member. Are you denying the people's the right to cheap and quality products just because our products aren't good enough? Please answer that in the POI before the 6 minutes. There you go. Shame. Now, let me tell you when. Okay, before, yes.
Look, even if you want to argue that also about like export happening, right? We think most of these big countries will be performing stuff like dumping, and because of their pressure and influence, they would now prevent any form of regulations which will exist under this free trade. So how are you going to prevent stuff like dumping, from bigger countries?
We still have law. Now, moving on. The when, how, and why. When, we need to start now because he gave out the idea of in the future. But as I've told you about, under his paradigm, it will always be infinity and the business will never happen. Now, how do we do so? As I've talked to you about how even if MACD comes and build infrastructure to monopoly the fast food chain market, right? We say what's the problem with that? It provides people with jobs that the government have fit to provide people with jobs. It provides people with trainings, increasing the quality of the workforce. We say what's wrong with that? And the third thing, he came up here. Let's say McDonald's comes up here and build infrastructures will benefit the people in the long run, even if McDonald's leaves. So what is wrong with that? And why do we need to do so? As I explained to you before, national economic growth have gone up 5.6% in just the third quarter. Well, let me tell you this. This happens because of exports under tariffs. If we were to have no tariffs or lesser tariffs from the free trade agreement that we made with a country, these exports can contribute even more towards the economic growth of Malaysia. We love Malaysia, don't we? And we want to see it in a higher standards in the global market. That's why go with closing opposition.
Thank you very much. Round of applause, shake hands, and sit back.